Welcome to Build Noet. In the last episode of Behind the Pages, we went into the Sulvar Mountains. We looked at the volcanoes, geothermal systems, fertile valleys, unstable terrain, and even the biology that allows the Sulvarins to survive in one of the hottest inhabited regions of Noet. But understanding where the Sulvarins live only answers part of the question, because an environment doesn't just shape bodies, it shapes behavior. Behavior becomes tradition, tradition becomes belief, and eventually belief becomes culture. So now I needed to ask, what would generations of living beside volcanoes teach the Sulvarins about God, identity, authority, and themselves? Normally, this is where I would start researching religions, civilizations, political systems, and the environment to begin piecing together what made sense. But that's not entirely how the Sulvarin religion developed, because while I was working on Noet, I had a vision. And I talked before about how I believe God works with me while I'm creating this world. I don't say that because I want you to look at Noet and think that makes me special. Actually, one of the reasons I make Behind the Pages is because I want to show you the process. I want you to see what it can look like to create with God, rather than simply asking God to bless something after you've already created it. For me, that doesn't mean I receive a vision and immediately declare that I understand what it means. I still have to examine it. I have to pray about it. I have to compare the ideas I'm seeing with Scripture. I have to research. I have to ask what kind of fruit an interpretation would produce. And sometimes I have to sit with something and receive His direction in pieces before I understand why I was shown it at all. That's what happened here. The vision wasn't presented to me as, here is the religion of the Sulvarins. Instead, it contained ideas about representation, identity, love, order, authority, and fire. As I worked through those ideas and their biblical meaning, something unexpected happened. I began recognizing how easily those same truths could become distorted if identity were moved away from God. And suddenly, I could see the Sulvarins. Not because God handed me a fictional religion already fully assembled, but because what I was learning gave me the theological framework I needed to understand the civilization I was already building. So before I show you how the Sulvarins turned these ideas into hierarchy, covenant, merit, challenge, and eventually government, I need to go back to the vision itself, because this is one of those places where world building and my walk with God collided. The environment gave the Sulvarins their circumstances. I also understand that if I'm telling you that I believe God participates in this creative process with me, there is an obvious question. Why would God help me develop a fictional religion that doesn't simply look like Christianity? Wouldn't the obvious thing be to give the Sulvarins a Christian framework and let Christianity provide the moral foundation of the story? The interesting answer is that Christianity does provide the foundation, just not necessarily in the way we might expect. One of the things I say frequently is that we readily acknowledge that no human being is perfect, yet sometimes we seem to expect imperfect people to practice relationship with God perfectly. We don't. We interpret, we misunderstand, we bring our fears with us, we bring our experiences with us. We bring our cultures, wounds, ambitions, assumptions, and desires with us. And sometimes we can begin with something true and follow it toward a conclusion that God never intended because we interpreted that truth without His wisdom. That's what makes the Sulvarins so useful to me. The vision gave me the principles. My job as the writer was to ask, what would happen if the civilization encountered those principles through the lens of the world that shaped them? And that's where the Sulvarins became much more complicated, because their religion didn't begin with conquest, it began with truths about God. The tragedy is what happened when they tried to interpret those truths through survival, strength, and their own power. I think this is where the Sulvarin religion becomes particularly important to what I'm trying to explore through Noet. The Sulvarins don't build their civilization entirely out of bad ideas. In fact, many of their ideas sound good. Representation, identity, love, order, authority, strength, and even fire, within the imagery I've been given, can represent something good. It can illuminate, reveal, refine, purify, and transform. The problem isn't necessarily the principle. The problem is what happens to the principle when it becomes separated from God. Because something can begin with an ideal and still rot. Order without God can become control. Authority without God can become domination. Strength without God can become superiority. Identity without God can become achievement. Love without God can become transaction. Representation without God can become idolatry. Even refinement can become cruelty when suffering itself becomes the measure of someone's worth. And I think that's much closer to what I want the Sulvarins to demonstrate. It would actually be easier to create a religion that is obviously evil. Give them an evil god, give them evil commandments, have them worship destruction and conquest. Then everyone watching would immediately know where they went wrong. But that doesn't teach us very much. The more unsettling possibility is that you can begin with something good. You can value family. You can value loyalty, discipline, achievement. You can value order, responsibility, strength, leadership, justice, or even sacrifice, and still end up somewhere terrible. Because the ideal itself cannot preserve its own goodness. God has to remain the foundation that continually defines what that ideal is supposed to express. Otherwise, we begin defining it ourselves, and once we do that, our fears get involved. Our pride, desire for control, our wounds, our hunger for recognition, and our fears get involved. Eventually, something that began by reflecting God can become a way of replacing Him. That's the path I see the Sulvarins taking. They recognize something divine in fire. Then, they recognize something resembling that fire within themselves. They see that fire reveals. They see that strength helps them survive. They see that hierarchy can create order. They see that covenants can create loyalty. None of those observations necessarily have to lead where the Sulvarins eventually take them. The separation happens when they become the ones deciding what those truths mean. Instead of receiving their identity from God, they earn it through achievement. Instead of allowing authority to serve, authority establishes superiority. Instead of love producing freely given relationship, love becomes an exchange of obligation. Instead of fire revealing identity, enduring fire becomes proof that someone deserves greater worth. And step by step, they construct an entire civilization around principles that still contain recognizable pieces of something good. Yet the fruit becomes increasingly rotten. That is what I want this religion to demonstrate. Separation from God doesn't always begin by choosing something obviously evil. Sometimes it begins by taking something good and believing we can preserve its goodness without Him. And if God is the source of life, truth, love, identity, and goodness, then separation from that source can only move in one direction, toward death, distortion, isolation, and ultimately hell. Not necessarily because someone wakes up one morning and announces, "I choose hell," but because separation itself creates the road there. And that's why I don't need the Sulvarins to practice Christianity perfectly in order for Christianity to remain the foundation underneath this story. In some ways, their failure allows me to examine the Christian claim from the opposite direction. What happens when we try to determine for ourselves what is good and what is evil? The Sulvarins are going to build something extraordinary. They're going to build order, loyalty, strength, and a sophisticated legal system. They're going to create mechanisms for accountability and advancement. They're even going to create ways of preventing absolute power from becoming completely unchecked. And it's still going to rot. Because ultimately, the problem isn't whether they built a good enough system. The problem is what they built it on. And I think that's a much more powerful way for me to explore what separation from God actually means. Therefore, developing a religion organically from the Sulvar environment, there is one force that would be almost impossible to ignore: fire. Fire is everywhere. It comes from beneath their feet, it pours down mountainsides, it warms their homes, it heats their water, it helps prepare their food, it powers industry. Volcanic destruction creates this mineral-rich soils that feed them. Fire destroys, fire creates. Fire kills, fire sustains life. So it made sense to me that the Sulvarins would eventually understand the divine through fire. Not necessarily as a person standing somewhere inside a volcano. Fire represents something more fundamental. And then there is something unusual about the Sulvarins themselves. When their bodies become hot, the vascular structures beneath their mineral white skin become increasingly visible. They glow an orange copper color. So imagine what their ancestors would have seen. Lava flows through the mountain, heat flows through their bodies. As they approach lava, their bodies increasingly glow to release heat. They understand something inside them seems to answer it. That's a powerful religious revelation, that the divine flows through us. But there's a problem. They can't get too close. The closer a Sulvarin gets to extreme heat, the brighter those structures become. But eventually, heat hurts. Move closer and tissue becomes damaged. Closer still and you die. So their relationship with the divine develops an interesting contradiction. The divine is within you, but you cannot withstand the fullness of the divine. There is a boundary. There is a place you can stand and a place you cannot. And I think that physical reality would eventually become spiritual language. Everything has a place, everything has a limit, and knowing your place keeps you alive. Suddenly, hierarchy doesn't begin as a political invention, it begins as an observation about existence. Then there is another principle. Fire reveals. Put different materials into heat and you discover things about them. Some endure, some change, some become stronger, others break, and still others burn. The Sulvarins experience something similar within their own bodies. Heat makes something normally hidden beneath their skin become visible. So one of their central religious beliefs becomes fire reveals identity, and there's truth in that. The problem begins when the Sulvarins decide that because they have discovered one thing fire does, they now understand what fire means. They flatten it. Fire reveals, so they decide its purpose is revelation. Fire tests, so they decide its purpose is testing. Fire exposes strength and weakness, so they decide strength and weakness must be what the divine is measuring. But fire does more than test. Fire warms, illuminates, consumes, transforms, purifies, destroys. And in the Sulvar Mountains, the same volcanic activity that can destroy a landscape also participates in creating new land and fertile soil. So which one represents the divine? The answer might be all of them, and still more. This is where randomly opening the Bible to 1 Chronicles becomes sudden revelation through David and the Ark of the Covenant. When I was reading 1 Chronicles, chapters 13 and 15 stood out to me. David wants to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And when you read that account, worship doesn't feel like this tiny compartment of people's lives. There is music, there are singers, there are musicians, sacrifices, shouting, there are trumpets and cymbals and harps and lyres. David is dancing, people are celebrating. Worship has sound, movement, food. community, sacrifice, joy. Their bodies are participating in it. Their art is participating in it. Their relationships are participating in it. Their lives are participating in worship to God. And David dedicates enormous numbers of people to maintaining worship around the presence of God. That made me think how differently religious devotion can sometimes be described today. You hear about monks or nuns dedicating their entire lives to prayer, and from the outside that can sound almost painfully dull. They prayed all day. That's because we've taken something enormous and compressed it into a sentence. Even within Christianity, we can accidentally reduce relationship with God to certain designated activities. Prayer is when I talk to God. Worship is when we sing songs at church. Church happens for an hour or two. Then I return to ordinary life. And perhaps what has become flat isn't necessarily the practice itself, it's our understanding of what relationship with God actually encompasses. Look at the Exodus. God doesn't simply tell Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Repeatedly, the demand is essentially, "Let my people go so that they may serve me." Freedom wasn't merely freedom from Egypt, it was freedom for relationship with God. Then God establishes covenant. He dwells among them. He gives them ways of living with one another. Their calendar changes. Their food changes. Their celebrations, sacrifices, their understanding of justice, their relationship with time, and their identity changes. God isn't being added to one corner of Israelite life. Relationship with Him begins reorganizing the whole thing. And yet the Israelites do what human beings continually do. They complain, they become afraid, they focus on what they lack, they create idols, they attempt to make the invisible God understandable through something they can see and control. They take something transcendent and reduce it to something manageable. And suddenly, I was looking at the Sulvarins again. This is important because I'm not arguing that organized religion, liturgy, monasteries, churches, religious offices, or structured prayer are inherently bad. David organized worship. Israel had priests. They were appointed sacrifices. There were festivals. There were procedures for transporting the ark. In fact, 1 Chronicles chapters 13 and 15 make an extraordinary point about this. The first time David attempts to move the ark, they don't follow the prescribed order. Uzzah dies. Then, David tries again in chapter 15. He recognizes that the Levites must carry the ark according to what God commanded. So the biblical answer isn't structure kills relationship, it's much more interesting. Structure is supposed to serve relationship with God rather than replace God as the source of the structure. David doesn't get to decide what God's holiness means merely because David passionately wants God's presence. And that distinction matters enormously for the Sulvarins. They encounter something they understand as divine, fire. They see it outside of themselves. They see their own bodies respond to it. They recognize that it reveals. So far, none of that is necessarily wrong. Their mistake is believing that they can determine the boundaries of what that revelation means. They take something vast and make it manageable. Fire reveals strength. Therefore, strength reveals identity. Therefore, endurance demonstrates worth. Therefore, they are defining the divine in a way that validates them. That's the inversion, and perhaps that's what human beings have always been tempted to do. We encounter God, then we build language around the encounter. We build practices around it. We build institutions around it. Those things can be helpful, but eventually we can become so familiar with the container that we mistake the container for what it was built to hold. Prayer becomes words, worship becomes music, Service becomes obligation, religion becomes attendance, God becomes someone we ask for things. And then we wonder why dedicating an entire life to Him sounds boring. Maybe the problem isn't that the relationship itself lacks wonder. Maybe we failed to communicate the magnitude of what relationship with God can actually be. David, dancing before the ark, he doesn't look bored. Israel, celebrating before God, they don't look like people who have reluctantly surrendered interesting lives so they can perform religious duties. Their relationship with God encompasses music, celebration, sacrifice, community, food, movement, law, identity, work, rest, and eventually their entire understanding of themselves. And that's what brings me back to fire. If fire is my representation of the divine within the Sulvarin religion, then it shouldn't have one tidy meaning. It shouldn't, because God doesn't. Not in the sense that God is contradictory, but in the sense that the fullness of God exceeds the dimensions through which we encounter Him. A three-dimensional civilization encountering something that extends beyond what it can perceive will always encounter only part of it. The mistake is assuming the part is the whole. The Sulvarins see that fire reveals. They're right. They just stop listening too soon. They discover something true and then build walls around it. Fire reveals, fire tests, fire exposes. And instead of remaining in relationship with the divine and allowing their understanding to continue expanding, they turn revelation into doctrine, doctrine into measurement, measurement into hierarchy, and hierarchy into worth. They conquer the meaning of fire the same way they conquered the mountain. And in trying to control it, they diminish it. Not because the fire itself becomes smaller, but because their understanding of it does. And once they've made their understanding of the divine small enough to control, they can use it to validate almost anything. Their hierarchy, suffering, ambition, authority, definition of strength, definition of worth. So maybe the first rotten fruit isn't endurance becomes achievement. Maybe it happens one step earlier. The Sulvarins encounter the divine and decide they understand Him well enough to stop being taught. And from there, endurance becomes achievement, achievement becomes identity, identity becomes worth. The fire was supposed to keep revealing. They turned revelation into a conclusion. The Sulvarins are trying to answer a legitimate human question. What makes me matter? But they try to answer it through their own power and might. As I stated in the previous episode, the concept becomes, if I endure, I matter. If I accomplish, I matter. If I rise, I matter. If I conquer what threatens me, I matter. The problem is that achievement can never permanently answer that question. If my identity comes from strength, then I can never safely become weak. If my identity comes from success, failure threatens who I am. If my identity comes from rank, then losing my position becomes more than losing a job. I lose part of myself. And if being above someone proves my value, then I eventually need someone beneath me. The Sulvarins have taken something that can reveal capability and allowed it to determine identity. The true answer to identity and value is found in God. Identity is received before it is proven. Strength doesn't make me valuable. Achievement doesn't make me valuable. Authority doesn't make me valuable. Those things can become expressions of what I do. They were never supposed to determine who I am, though. The Sulvarins don't understand that distinction, and eventually they build an entire civilization around it. A commander giving contradictory instructions during an evacuation matters. When disaster comes, somebody needs to make a decision. Someone needs to lead. Others need to respond. Chaos can kill everyone. So another religious principle develops. Leadership exists to bring order from chaos. And suddenly, hierarchy becomes sacred. Everything has a place. Everyone has a responsibility. Everyone answers to someone. Authority flows downward. Service and loyalty flow upward. And at the very top stands the king. The Sulvarin king is not necessarily the divine himself. He represents divine order within civilization. The divine brings order to creation. The king brings order to the Sulvarins. Authority then moves through the civilization beneath him. The king delegates authority to those below him. They delegate authority beneath themselves. Eventually, Sulvarin society becomes an enormous branching hierarchy. And there's something wonderfully appropriate about that imagery. Lava flows through channels in the mountain. Heat moves through branching vessels beneath Sulvarin skin. Water moves through channels in their cities. Authority moves through the hierarchy. Fire flows. Blood flows. Authority flows. Loyalty flows. The pattern repeats. But authority has to be earned. Here's where I didn't want to create a simple hereditary monarchy or rigid caste system, because that would actually contradict Sulvarin theology. If fire reveals identity and achievement reveals capability, then why should an incompetent person remain above someone demonstrably more capable simply because they were born there? So Sulvarin hierarchy has movement built into it. Authority must continually justify itself. At first, that sounds remarkably fair, maybe even admirable. If your commander becomes incompetent, someone better can replace them. If an apprentice surpasses their master, they can advance. If someone demonstrates greater ability, the system supposedly recognizes it. But there's another reason I designed Sulvarin society this way. I wanted it to be exhausting, because everyone is looking up. The subordinate is trying to reach the position above them. The superior is looking down because somebody beneath them may eventually take their place. So the subordinate can't relax, but neither can the superior. Achieve, perform, improve, compete, protect your position, prepare for the next one, prove that you still deserve to be where you are, and then do it again. The hierarchy doesn't simply organize Sulvarin society, it occupies their attention. And that matters. Because if I'm spending all of my energy asking, how do I get above you? I'm probably spending considerably less energy asking, why are we arranged this way in the first place? This is something I wanted to explore because systems of control don't always survive by visibly forcing everyone into obedience. Control doesn't always look like a cage. Sometimes they survive by giving people somewhere else to direct their attention. History gives us much darker examples of laws and institutions deliberately controlling movement, association, education, economic independence, and relationships between groups in order to preserve existing power. And systems of domination frequently benefit when people who might otherwise recognize a common problem are divided, categorized, suspicious of one another, or occupied with their immediate survival. The mechanisms change across history. The underlying question doesn't. Where is everyone's attention being directed? That question matters to me as a Christian because Paul says in Ephesians 6 that we don't wrestle merely against flesh and blood, but against rulers, authorities, and spiritual forces. I understand that to mean I shouldn't reduce evil entirely to finding the right human villain. People participate in systems. People benefit from systems. People perpetuate systems. But patterns of domination can outlive the individuals occupying them. The faces change, the language changes, the institutions change, And yet, certain patterns keep appearing: fear, division, competition, dehumanization, control. The elevation of some people through the diminishment of others. So, if I'm trying to write Noet partly as an American myth, I don't want to reproduce one particular historical institution and put alien clothing on it. I want to explore the pattern underneath it. This is where the Sulvarin system becomes particularly effective. The person at the bottom isn't told, "You will always remain at the bottom." They're told, "You can rise, train harder, work harder, accumulate achievements, find the right mentor, prepare for the challenge, prove yourself. And if you fail, the system has an answer for that too. You weren't ready. Try again. If your superior remains above you, they prove to themselves. If someone else advances faster, they earned it. If you remain where you are, work harder." The system continually redirects attention toward individual performance, and because advancement genuinely is possible, the system becomes much harder to recognize as controlling. Some people really do rise. Some people really do begin with very little and reach extraordinary positions. Those people then become evidence that the hierarchy works. Look at them. They did it. Why haven't you? Now the exception doesn't necessarily expose the system, it can help legitimize it. And here's the part I find particularly important. The superior isn't necessarily free either. They've reached the position everyone beneath them wants. Now they have to keep it. Someone younger is training. Someone more ambitious is watching. Someone underneath them may be waiting for the next challenge season. So achievement doesn't produce peace. Achievement produces something else to lose. The higher you climb, the more carefully you have to protect your position. That means the system can control people at multiple levels simultaneously. The person beneath you is afraid they'll never become you. You're afraid they'll eventually replace you. Both of you remain focused on each other. Meanwhile, very few people are looking at the structure itself. This is one of the reasons stories like Animal Farm in 1984 remain so powerful. They aren't memorable merely because they contain cruel leaders. They explore how power manipulates perception. Language matters. Information matters. Fear matters. Who you're taught to blame? It matters. What you're encouraged to desire matters. Even what questions occur to you matters. That's the territory I want to explore with the Sulvarins. Their government doesn't have to stand over every citizen saying, "You are being controlled." It can tell them, "You are being given an opportunity." And that's much more interesting because the statement isn't completely false. They do have opportunities. They can advance. Their leaders can be challenged. The system does reward competence. That's precisely why it works. The Sulvarins are free to compete, free to achieve, free to challenge, free to advance, free to accumulate status, free to become the person everyone else wants to become. What they are rarely encouraged to do is question the assumption beneath all of it. Why should achievement determine identity at all? Why does having greater authority make someone greater? Why should losing a position threaten who I am? Why am I measuring myself against the person above me? Why does someone need to stand beneath me before I can know that I matter? And perhaps most dangerously, who benefits from keeping all of us climbing? That's where the Sulvarin meritocracy stops being merely a clever political system. It becomes part of their spiritual problem, because everyone is trying to prove their identity through achievement. Everyone is trying to make themselves matter. Everyone is trying to get closer to the top. and nobody has time to discover that the question they're exhausting themselves trying to answer has already been answered by God. Your worth was never waiting at the top of the ladder. And if you knew that, you might finally stop climbing long enough to ask who built it. That's where the Sulvarin meritocracy stops being merely a clever political system. It becomes part of their spiritual problem. And that's when I realized, this is Babel. Not literally. There doesn't need to be a giant tower in the middle of the Sulvar Mountains. The hierarchy itself is the tower. Because what did humanity say at Babel? Let us make a name for ourselves. That's the Sulvarin civilization. They are trying to make a name for themselves through strength, achievement, rank, conquest, legacy, through the families they build, through how much pain they can endure, through how high they can climb. And the tragedy of Babel wasn't simply that human beings constructed a tall building. The tower was the physical expression of a spiritual problem. Human beings were attempting to establish significance, security, utility, and identity through what they could build for themselves. The Sulvarins do exactly the same thing, except instead of building one tower out of bricks, they build an entire civilization out of achievement, and everybody gets a rung. That makes their meritocracy even more interesting to me, because the system promises, climb high enough and you will matter. Become a master, become a commander, become a general, become the head of your family, become powerful enough that nobody can overlook you, and ultimately become king. But every rung creates another rung. Every achievement creates another standard. Every position creates something else you can lose. So nobody ever actually reaches the thing they're climbing toward, because they're trying to solve an identity problem with achievement. An achievement cannot tell you who you are. It can only tell you what you have accomplished. That's Babel. Let us make a name for ourselves, not let us receive the name God gives us. And suddenly, the Sulvarin hierarchy becomes a physical representation of separation from God. They're climbing upward, trying to reach through their own strength what can only be received through relationship with God, which connects to something I've talked about before. Babel tries to ascend. God's pattern repeatedly begins with descent. God comes down. Christ descends. We surrender. We repent. We admit that we cannot save ourselves, and only then does God raise us. The Sulvarins have reversed that pattern. Their entire civilization says, rise, prove yourself, become stronger, earn your identity, make your name, ascend, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And the higher they climb, the farther they move away from the answer they're actually looking for. Because the answer never was, become important enough that God notices you. The answer was, God already saw you. And this makes the king, representing the divine, even more significant. If the hierarchy is Babel, then the king stands at the top of the tower. He is the person who has supposedly accomplished what everyone beneath him is trying to accomplish. He has the greatest name, the greatest authority, the greatest representation, the highest position. Everyone looks up toward him, and that's precisely the problem. Their eyes stop at the king. The hierarchy was supposed to represent divine order. Instead, the representative gradually occupies the place of the one he was supposed to represent, and that's how representation becomes idolatry. They don't necessarily stop believing in the divine fire. They simply construct so many layers between themselves and the divine that eventually their relationship with God is mediated through achievement, hierarchy, authority, and finally, a man. The king becomes the summit everyone can see. The divine becomes the justification for why the summit exists. And now we've gone all the way back to the problem underneath the religion. They encountered something transcendent. They tried to understand it. Then they tried to contain it, organize it, then institutionalize it, and eventually they built a tower around it. That's why I think the Sulvarin religion can teach me more by being wrong than it ever could if I simply gave them all the right answers. Because Babel doesn't begin with people saying, let's become evil. It begins with people saying, let's build. Let's accomplish something. Let's create security. Let's establish ourselves. Let's make a name for ourselves. And that's the danger I'm trying to explore with the Sulvarins. There is nothing inherently wrong with building, achievement, leadership, excellence, strength, ambition, organization, or advancement. The question is, what are you asking those things to give you? Because if you're asking achievement to give you identity, if you're asking authority to give you worth, if you're asking status to make you matter, then eventually you're not just climbing a ladder, you're building Babel. And maybe that's the real reason the Sulvarins can never stop climbing. They aren't actually trying to reach the next position, they're trying to reach a name they were never supposed to give themselves. So when it comes to the Sulvarin society, I developed something I'm calling the right of challenge. A Sulvarin cannot simply attack their superior and take their position, because that would be chaos, and chaos is exactly what their civilization exists to prevent. Instead, advancement is regulated. If you believe you are capable of carrying the position immediately above you, you first have to qualify. You demonstrate the necessary accomplishments, education, experience, endurance, or skills required for that particular position. Then you petition. For most positions, that petition goes through the appropriate department. And importantly, you can only challenge directly upward. You don't skip 5 ranks because you think you're destined for greatness. You climb, one position at a time. Once a challenge has been approved, the person being challenged receives another important right, the right of answer. They can accept the challenge, or they can yield. And I really like what this does to the Sulvarin society, because surrender doesn't automatically mean disgrace. An older commander might recognize that the person they have been mentoring is ready. A master artisan might realize that their apprentice has surpassed them. A leader might simply know that they no longer possess the energy required to carry their position properly, so they yield. Not, you defeated me, but I recognize that you are ready to carry what I have carried. That creates a graceful path toward retirement. This also means an elderly Sulvarin doesn't become worthless simply because they can no longer physically perform as they once did. Their achievement remains theirs. Their honor remains. Their reputation remains. They may become advisors, teachers, judges, mentors, or respected elders. The culture can distinguish between what have you proven and what are you capable of carrying now. That distinction becomes extremely important, because otherwise nobody would ever willingly put authority down, although some people still won't. And this is where the system begins exposing the very problem underneath Sulvarin religion. Imagine someone who has spent 30 years being known as commander. People stand when they enter, people obey them, their family benefits from their position, their identity has slowly fused with their authority. Then someone younger challenges them. The system gives them the perfectly honorable way out. Yield, recognize the successor, retire with dignity. But they can't, because somewhere along the way, I carry authority became I am my authority. If I surrender the position, who am I? Suddenly, the burden isn't that they aren't allowed to put the weight down. Their identity won't allow them to. That led me to another interesting consequence. Sulvarin leaders would have an incentive to choose their successors. If I know someone will eventually replace me, I can spend my career desperately suppressing everyone beneath me, or I can prepare someone worthy of carrying what I built. So mentorship becomes part of leadership. A good Sulvarin leader doesn't merely exercise authority. They prepare someone else to exercise it after them. That creates what I would call earned inheritance. A military commander may spend decades preparing his son to succeed him. When the son becomes qualified, he petitions for the position. The father yields. From the outside, that looks hereditary. Father ruled, son rules. But technically, the son didn't inherit the position simply because he was born into the family. He spent his life being prepared to earn it. And the successor doesn't even have to be family. It can be an apprentice, a soldier, a student, a protege. So Sulvarin society develops both bloodlines and lines of mentorship. Of course, there's an obvious problem. A wealthy and powerful family can say anyone can rise. And technically they aren't lying, but their children have been trained since birth. They have better teachers, better equipment, better connections, more opportunities, more prestigious mentors. They know how the system works. So the Sulvarins can sincerely believe they have created a meritocracy, while powerful families continue holding the same positions for generations. Not because the law says this office belongs to your bloodline, but because that family has built an entire machine dedicated to producing the next person qualified to hold it. And suddenly, meritocracy can produce aristocracy without ever admitting that it has done so. Then we get to love. Sulvarin religion understands love primarily through covenant. Love binds. Love creates obligation. I protect you, you remain loyal to me. I provide, you serve. I teach, you honor. Sulvarins can feel affection. They can love deeply. But culturally, love becomes intertwined with commitment and obligation. To love someone means, in part, I bind myself to you. And once a covenant is entered, breaking it has consequences. This is also how their political system remains stable. Imagine three powerful families. Family A has entered a covenant of loyalty with Family B. Family C approaches A and says, "Help us overthrow B and we'll reward you." Family A simply can't switch sides. They are bound. If they betray Family B, they are in violation of the covenant. And betrayal might actually be considered more shameful than open challenge, because challenge says, I believe I am capable of standing above you and I will prove it openly. Betrayal says, I pretend to serve you while secretly undermining you. One is strength operating within order, the other is chaos hiding behind loyalty. Every formal Sulvarin covenant therefore establishes its terms beforehand. What do I owe you? What do you owe me? How long does this agreement last? What releases us from it? What constitutes violation? And what happens if either of us breaks it? Some require restitution. Some cost property. Some cost rank. Some dissolve protection. Some require service. And the most serious may carry lethal consequences. But the consequence is known when the covenant is made. The Sulvarins can therefore be extraordinarily harsh while simultaneously believing themselves extraordinarily fair. You knew the terms. You gave your word. Now the consequence belongs to you. This means the Sulvarins need courts. Power cannot simply decide what the rules mean whenever it becomes convenient. If Family A believes Family B violated their covenant, they can petition the court. If the court determines that Family B broke the agreement first, Family A may be released from loyalty. Then they are free to form another alliance. The courts don't eliminate conflict, they channel it. Just as the Sulvarins channel geothermal energy rather than allowing it to erupt wherever it wants. And that principle governs violence. Most achievement challenges are not lethal. There is no reason two engineers need to kill each other to determine who is better at maintaining geothermal infrastructure. But certain challenges can result in death, and those require court approval. Before such a challenge becomes official, the court examines the circumstances. Who has standing? What agreements already exist? What happens to dependents? What happens to property? What happens to the people under the person's authority? Will the challenge destabilize something larger? Only after those questions are answered can a lethal challenge proceed. Otherwise, killing your superior is not advancement, it's murder. Again, challenge is order, assassination is chaos. And I think this becomes even more interesting if advancement isn't happening randomly throughout the calendar. What if there are appointed religious seasons when challenges are encouraged? For most of the time, people prepare. They train, they study, they accomplish, they seek mentorship, they build reputations, they fulfill prerequisites. Then the appointed season arrives, challenges are announced, superiors give their answers, some defend their positions, some yield, positions change, new leaders rise, and because one promotion creates a vacancy beneath it, advancement can cascade through the hierarchy. For a short period, Sulvarin society intentionally permits controlled instability. Then the hierarchy settles again, which is incredibly appropriate for people shaped by volcanoes. Pressure builds, the eruption comes, the landscape changes, then order returns. They have essentially ritualized the mountain. And now we reach the part that makes this system extremely effective at maintaining control. It gives dissatisfaction somewhere to go. Don't like your position? Advance. Think your commander is incompetent? Challenge them. Want more influence in your family? Earn it. Think your covenant partner has failed you? Take them to court. Want greater authority? Prove you can carry it. People don't necessarily look at the hierarchy and ask, why does this hierarchy exist? They ask, how do I move higher within it? That's an enormous difference. If people believe anyone can theoretically rise, then inequality can be interpreted as evidence of merit. The person at the bottom doesn't necessarily conclude the system has failed me. They may conclude I haven't proven myself yet. And while the subordinate is working harder to advance, the superior is working harder to prevent being surpassed. The entire civilization runs on ambition. And eventually all of this reaches the throne. The king represents divine order. There is no authority above him. So challenging the king would require the highest religious and judicial authorization in Sulvarin society. The challenger would have to demonstrate standing, qualification, achievement, perhaps even failures of the current king. Then, if the challenge is approved, the king receives the same right every other Sulvarin receives, accept or yield. If he yields, succession is peaceful. If he accepts, then I think the royal challenge becomes one of the rare challenges that must end in death. Because according to Sulvarin theology, there cannot be two supreme representatives of divine order. And that finally gives me the cultural mechanism I need for the Sulvarin prince. Eventually, the prince doesn't simply kill his father and take the throne. He must become worthy of challenging him. He must petition according to order. He must stand before his father, and his father must choose, recognize your successor or defend your place, which means a good Sulvarin king spends years doing something incredibly dangerous. He trains the person who may someday replace him, and perhaps that's the ultimate test of Sulvarin leadership. Can you recognize when the person beneath you has become capable of carrying what you carry? Can you surrender authority without believing you've surrendered your identity? Can you put the weight down? Because that's where I think the tragedy of Sulvarin civilization finally becomes visible. There are actually some admirable principles here. Leaders should remain competent. Authority should carry responsibility. People should be allowed to advance. Promises should mean something. Power should be restrained by law. Leaders should prepare successors. Even the king should be accountable. The problem is the assumption underneath them. Capability becomes identity. Identity becomes worth. So the system can become incredibly sophisticated at determining who is best equipped to carry authority, while completely misunderstanding what makes the person carrying the authority valuable. And eventually, fire reveals capability. Religion turns capability into identity. Hierarchy turns identity into position. Meritocracy makes position something that must be earned. Covenant stabilizes the hierarchy. Challenge keeps the hierarchy moving. And culture begins mistaking where someone stands within the hierarchy for what that person is worth. The Sulvarins have created an incredibly elaborate system for answering the question, how do I make myself matter in a world that doesn't seem to care whether I do? The answer is prove yourself, rise, endure, achieve, carry more, become stronger, stand above, and keep proving it so nobody can take your place. But the answer they actually need is the one their religion cannot give them. Your position was never supposed to tell you your value. Your strength was never supposed to create your identity. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of a people who believe fire reveals who you are, because the fire may reveal what they can carry. It may reveal what they can endure. It may reveal what they can accomplish, but it cannot tell them why they matter. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Behind the Pages. In our next episode, we will be stepping into Chapter 6. In the meantime, may God bless you and keep you.